Do I have the right to tell you the truth? I mean, it sounds simple, maybe just philosophical, but what if it's actually like one of the biggest ethical questions we face, not just for AI, but, every day? Today, we're really jumping into some sources that get right to the heart of this exact question.
Yeah, we are. It's this really complex area, isn't it? Deciding if and when, and maybe most importantly, how we share what we think is true with someone else.
Right. How do you balance wanting to inform someone with, well, respecting their autonomy?
Exactly. And we've got two really interesting angles on this today. First up is Mo Gawdat.
Ah, yes. Former chief business officer at Google X.
Mm-hmm.
He actually sees this question as maybe the central moral issue for big AI systems.
He really does. And then second, we're digging into this fascinating paper. It looks at the very same dilemma, but on a much smaller scale, like in one-on-one conversations, specifically using a method called Street Epistemology.
Okay, so our mission today is kind of to pull out the key ideas from both, from the big AI picture and the personal conversation level, to understand why just stating facts isn't always enough or even the right thing to do.
Precisely. What are the responsibilities involved? Let's start with Mo Gawdat. People might know him from Google X or his book Solve for Happy.
Yeah, he puts that question, do I have the right to tell you the truth?
Hmm.
Right at the center when discussing these huge AI chatbots, the ones millions of people use.
Yeah, and what I found really insightful was his description of the internal debates they had back at Google X. He said technically the engineers were ready. They could build systems to synthesize tons of info and give a single answer.
But ethically, they hesitated.
Deeply. They really grappled with the implications of presenting one synthesized answer, essentially, their calculated version of truth, to, potentially billions of people.
Okay, so this is key. Gawdat isn't saying objective truth doesn't exist. That's not the point.
No, not at all.
His focus is on the act of telling the truth, especially when you do it at massive scale. When an AI decides what's important, what gets left out, how it's phrased, it shapes how users understand things.
And potentially how they act. And crucially, the user hasn't really given explicit consent for that kind of, cognitive influence.
It's like the AI gets this default authority.
Exactly, whether it intends to or not. And Gawdat bases the ethics of this on two main pillars. First, a duty of care. Meaning, if the information you give someone could change their beliefs, their decisions, their actions, you then take on some responsibility for the potential consequences, especially harm.
Right, like if an AI gives dodgy medical advice or bad financial tips or even pushes biased political views.
Precisely. The platform isn't just a neutral pipe, it has a moral weight because of the downstream effects.
Okay, that makes sense. And the second pillar?
The second is epistemic humility. This one's huge. Basically acknowledging that absolute certainty is, pretty much impossible. Especially with complex models, they make mistakes, they can hallucinate.
So the right to tell the truth isn't absolute. It's always kind of provisional, offered with a side of, we might be wrong.
That's the idea. It needs that humility baked in. So for Gawdat, the whole ethical question shifts.
I hope so.
It moves from just, can we compute the answer, to something much deeper. Can we ethically justify imposing this potentially flawed truth onto someone's mental landscape and take responsibility for what happens next?
Wow. Okay. That's a heavy lift.
It is. And you can see how this lines up really nicely with street epistemology, which we'll get into. SE is much more about exploring together than one person declaring the truth.
Yeah, Gawdat has talked about this overlap, hasn't he? I think I've seen clips, maybe on podcasts.
Yeah, Diary of a CEO, some shorter online things too. He sees the connection.
Which leads us perfectly to the other source we're looking at today. This paper, its title is literally Exploring Ethical Truth-Telling in Street Epistemology. Do I have the right to tell you the truth?
Yes, and this paper zooms right in on how that big question plays out in these specific kinds of interpersonal chats about beliefs.
So maybe a quick refresher for anyone who isn't familiar. What exactly is street epistemology, or SE?
Sure. Think of it as a conversational toolkit, really. It's designed to help someone gently examine why they hold a particular belief, especially one that's deeply held or maybe hard to test. It uses respectful dialogue, lots of questions, and crucially, that epistemic humility we just talked about.
It was described by Peter Boghossian, right?
Yeah.
And Anthony Magnabosco really popularized showing it in action.
That's right. And inherently, the whole practice bumps up against this dilemma. When do you share information? How do you avoid sounding like you have all the answers? How do you make sure the other person feels respected and in control of their own thinking?
And here's something really important for you listening. This specific paper we're discussing, the research for it, was actually done using ChatGPT 4.5.
Yeah, with advanced reasoning turned on, which is pretty meta, right? Using AI to explore human ethical questions about truth-telling.
Definitely. And if you want to read the whole thing, you absolutely can. It's up on Substack. We'll put the link directly in the show notes for you.
Yeah, definitely worth checking out.
Okay, so the paper looks at the psychology involved when you're having an SE conversation, especially if you're touching on someone's core beliefs.
Right. And a big one is cognitive dissonance. You know, that uncomfortable feeling you get when new information clashes hard with a belief you really care about.
Yeah, nobody likes that feeling. And the paper points out, drawing on research like Nayan and Reifler's, that if you just barge in and challenge someone too bluntly,
it can backfire big time. The person might just dig their heels in even harder, becoming more convinced of their original belief, even if it's wrong. It's a defense mechanism.
So just hammering someone with facts isn't always the way.
Often it isn't. Then there's reactance and autonomy. This comes from Jack Brem's work. It's that almost automatic resistance people feel when they think someone is trying to force a viewpoint on them, trying to take away their freedom to think for themselves.
It's that don't tell me what to believe reaction. Very human.
Yeah, very human. And the paper argues that good SE practice is designed to minimize this by getting clear consent, by framing it as exploring together, and by the practitioner genuinely showing humility, not acting like the expert with a capital T truth.
So it's more like, hey, I'm curious how you arrived at that conclusion, rather than, let me tell you why you're wrong.
Exactly. It respects their autonomy, and related to that is information avoidance.
Information avoidance, you mean?
Yeah.
People sometimes just don't want to know.
Sometimes, yeah. Research by people like Goldman, Hagman, and Lowenstein shows that people might actually prefer ignorance if the truth seems too distressing or disruptive to their life or worldview.
That makes sense too.
Click subscribe. It's cheaper than hay and twice as fun. And SE respects this because the conversations are voluntary. The person being interviewed, so to speak, has to agree to explore a topic, and they can pause or stop anytime. It safeguards their, emotional space. It's not about forcing uncomfortable truths down someone's throat.
It's about respecting their boundaries, even their epistemic boundaries.
Well put, yeah.
Okay, so that covers some of the psychological terrain. The paper also looks at SE through different ethical lenses, right? Like the shoulds and shouldn'ts.
It does. It looks at it from a Kantian viewpoint first. Kant emphasized a duty to be truthful, not to deceive. And SE aligns with that. The goal is honest exploration, not manipulation.
But is it always that simple? The paper raises a potential conflict, doesn't it?
It does. A strict Kantian might say you always have to state the full truth as you see it. But the paper suggests, well, what about relational ethics? What about compassion? Sometimes, maybe strategically holding back or being silent on a point might actually be more ethical in that specific moment if blurting out the truth would cause unnecessary harm or break trust.
So there's a tension between absolute truth-telling and, say, caring for the person or the relationship.
Exactly. Then there's the utilitarian perspective, thinking about the consequences, like John Stuart Mill might.
Balancing the good versus the bad.
Pretty much. Weighing the potential benefit, maybe the person revises a harmful belief against the potential harm, the emotional distress the conversation might cause, or damage to the relationship.
So the SE practitioner has to make a judgment call. Is pursuing this line of questioning likely to lead to a greater overall good, considering everything?
Right. It's not just about being right, it's about the overall impact. And finally, the paper brings in care ethics, drawing from thinkers like Carol Gilligan.
This focuses more on empathy. Relationships.
Exactly. Empathy, context, compassion. It stresses being really attentive to the other person's emotional state, making sure they feel safe, respected.
It really emphasizes that these are human interactions, not just logic puzzles. You're talking with a person.
Precisely. You're not just doing epistemology at them. You have to care about their experience of the conversation.
Which seems to connect directly to the issue of power dynamics in SE.
It does. The stated goal of SE is actually to kind of flatten the power dynamic, to democratize epistemic authority.
Meaning, empower the other person to examine their own thinking, rather than relying on the practitioner as the authority.
That's the ideal. But the paper cautions that practitioners need to be really self-aware. Even unintentionally, power imbalances can emerge.
How so?
Maybe one person just seems more knowledgeable or is a more confident speaker or even just initiated the conversation. So vigilance is needed to keep it truly collaborative, not drifting into one person subtly leading the other.
Always aiming for exploration, not proclamation.
Beautifully put. Yes.
Okay, so if we pull all these threads together, the psychology, the different ethical angles, the power stuff, what does the paper suggest are the practical takeaways for SE folks, or really for anyone having these kinds of tricky conversations? What if you could challenge what you believe and come out stronger? Start now at navigatingbeliefs.com.
Well, first and foremost, consent and clarity. Be upfront about your intentions. Make sure the other person is genuinely willing to have this kind of exploratory chat.
No ambushing.
Definitely no ambushing. Second, maintain that epistemic humility we keep coming back to. Position yourself as a curious partner, not the teacher with all the answers.
Easier said than done sometimes, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. It takes practice. Third, a real focus on mitigation of harm. Be tuned in to the other person's reactions. Use sensitive language. Recognize those psychological defenses we talked about and don't just crash through them.
Be gentle.
Be gentle, yes. And finally, consider incremental disclosure. If you have information or a perspective to share, maybe introduce it gradually. Give the person space to process things at their own speed rather than hitting them with everything at once.
Okay, that all sounds like really solid advice. So
Right.
if we zoom back out now,
Yeah.
you can really see the link between Gawdat worrying about AI's truth-telling power.
And this deep dive into the ethics of one-on-one conversations in SE, they're operating at totally different scales, but fundamentally asking the same question: do I have the right to tell you the truth?
And fascinatingly, they seem to arrive at similar places, that the right isn't automatic. It comes with conditions.
Yeah, conditions like humility, taking responsibility for impact, respecting autonomy, and shifting away from just declaring things towards something more collaborative or careful.
And this really matters for you listening, because we all face versions of this, don't we? Maybe not with AI, but with partners, family, colleagues, online.
Every day, you're constantly making choices about whether to speak up, what to say, how to say it, when you think something is true but may be difficult.
So understanding these ideas, cognitive dissonance, reactance, duty of care, the utilitarian balance, the need for humility, it gives you a better toolkit, doesn't it, for navigating those tricky moments more thoughtfully.
Hopefully, yeah. It helps move beyond just wanting to be right and towards considering the responsibility and the relationship involved in sharing truth.
We started with this huge question facing AI developers.
And ended up seeing how the exact same ethical and psychological knots are tied up in our most basic human interactions.
It really drives home that telling the truth, or what we perceive as truth, isn't just a simple act. It's a complex interaction with real responsibilities.
Absolutely. The right to do it is earned, perhaps through care and humility, not just assumed.
So here's something to maybe mull over this week. Think about a time recently when you shared a tough truth, or maybe when someone shared one with you. How did those dynamics we talked about, maybe reactance, maybe information avoidance, maybe the feeling of care or lack of it, how did that play out?
Yeah. And reflecting on this deep dive, thinking about Gawdat's concerns and the SE approach, does it suggest maybe handling similar situations differently next time? What would that look like for you?
Lots to think about. And just a reminder, if you want to dive deeper into the Street Epistemology paper, especially the bit about using ChatGPT for the research.
You can find it on Substack. The link is right there in the show notes for you.
Until next time.